Hey everyone, this is a chapter from Massimo Salvadori's Karl Kautsky and the Socialist Revolution, 1880 to 1938. Um, the chapter is titled, what is the chapter titled? um, I'm on. World Imperialism and Russian Revolution. It's chapter 9 of the book. I'm probably not going to read this whole book. I'm just reading for the parts that are talking about the Russian Revolution. And this has a bit about the Russian Revolution. So let's see. Here we go. Section 1, the hypothesis of, quote, ultra-imperialism. At the outbreak of the First World War, Kautsky played a significant role in the special session of the SPD Parliamentary Caucus held on the 3rd of August 1914 to decide what attitude party deputies should adopt in the Reichstag vote on the war credits, scheduled for the following day. The session decided by 78 to 14 that the SPD should vote in favor of them. The most energetic leader of the majority was David, who was to be prominent among those social democrats prepared to give full support to German imperialism. I don't know who this David is. It probably was mentioned in an earlier part of the book. Kautsky's approach to the crisis was fully consistent with the positions Kautsky had developed during previous years. The idea of a frontal clash with the ruling class was wholly alien to Kautsky. Kautsky was determined that the party not appear anti-patriotic, and Kautsky wanted it to preserve maximum room for political maneuver without being victimized by systematic repression. At the same time, however, Kautsky held that it was of prime importance for the political future of social democracy that the party refused to compromise itself by unconditional adherence to the policy of the imperial government. On the 27th of July, 1914, Kautsky had written to Victor Adler that he had been, quote, very surprised by the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, and that he saw the rush to war as a, quote, act of desperation on the part of people incapable of far-sighted policy. This seems to be in reference to the July crisis. And Wikipedia says, the July crisis was a series of interrelated diplomatic and military escalations among the major powers of Europe in the summer of 1914, which led to the outbreak of World War I. The crisis began on the 28th of June 1914 when Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb nationalist, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. A complex web of alliances coupled with the miscalculations of numerous political and military leaders, who either regarded war as in their best interest or felt that a general war would not occur, resulted in an outbreak of hostilities amongst most of the major European states by August 1914. Following the murder, Austria-Hungary sought to inflict a military blow on Serbia to demonstrate its own strength and to dampen Serbian support for Yugoslav nationalism, viewing it as a threat to the unity of the multinational empire. However, Vienna, wary of a reaction of Russia, a major supporter of Serbia, sought a guarantee from its ally Germany that Berlin would support Austria in any conflict. Germany guaranteed its support through what came to be known as the, quote, blank check, but urged Austria-Hungary to attack quickly to localize the war and avoid drawing in Russia. However, Austro-Hungarian leaders would deliberate until mid-July before deciding to give Serbia a harsh ultimatum. and would not attack without a full mobilization of the army. In the meantime, France met with Russia, reaffirmed their alliance, and agreed they would support Serbia against Austria-Hungary in the event of a war. Austria-Hungary made its ultimatum to Serbia on the 23rd of July before Serbia replied. Russia ordered a secret but noticed partial mobilization of its armed forces. Though Russia's military leadership knew they were not yet strong enough for a general war, they believed that the Austro-Hungarian grievance against Serbia was a pretext orchestrated by Germany and considered a forceful response to the best course of action. Russia's partial mobilization, the first major military action not undertaken by a direct participant in the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, increased the willingness of Serbia to defy the threat of an Austro-Hungarian attack. It also alarmed the German leadership, having not anticipated the idea of needing to fight Russia before France. While the United Kingdom was semi-formally aligned with Russia and France, many British leaders saw no compelling reason to get involved militarily. The UK made repeated offers to mediate, and Germany made various promises to try to ensure British neutrality. However, fearing the possibility of Germany overrunning France, Britain entered the war against them on the 4th of August and used the German invasion of Belgium to galvanize popular support. By early August, the ostensible reason for armed conflict, the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke, had already become a side note to a larger European war. All right, back to the text. On the 27th of July, 1914, Kautsky had written to Victor Adler that he had been, quote, very surprised by the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, and that he saw the rush to war as a, quote, act of desperation on the part of people incapable of acting on incapable of any far-sighted policy. If a world war should break out, Kautsky continued, quote, then our policy would be exceedingly difficult, since one cannot work simultaneously for the destruction of Austria and Tsarism, end quote. On the other hand, Kautsky added, quote, to limit oneself to wringing one's hands over the horrors of war is not a policy, end quote. Kautsky in a letter to Victor Adler. And Wikipedia says Victor Adler lived from 1852 to 1918 and was an Austrian politician, a leader of the labor movement, and founder of the Social Democratic Workers' Party, SDAP, which is the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Back to the text. This is a very revealing letter, for it showed unmistakably that Kautsky had abandoned the positions formerly expressed in Patriotismus und Sozialdemokratie, when he had argued that the fundamental duty of social democracy was to struggle against the militarism of its own country, and had denied that it was possible to support a war on the basis of a counterposition between liberal democratic and authoritarian powers. Kautsky now viewed the international conflict precisely through the prism of that counterposition, implicitly assigning social democracy a particular role within it. For Kautsky, in effect, the difficulty for the SPD now lay in the fact that Germany might find itself in a struggle against Tsarism in alliance with Austria, the, quote, prison house of peoples, end quote. It is indicative that the letter contained not one word about the role of Germany as the spearhead of imperialist expansionism in Europe, or its primary responsibility for the deterioration of international relations, which Kautsky had energetically asserted and denounced in the very recent past. Kautsky was invited to attend the session because of his reputation as a theoretician, even though Kautsky was not a member of parliament. According to Kautsky's own oft-repeated account, Kautsky went to the meetings intending to recommend abstention on the vote over war credits. This line, however, was rejected by the caucus, which divided between those who advocated voting for credits and those who advocated voting against. Then, quote, only because this, bracket, abstention, and bracket, had been rejected by everyone, end quote, he proposed that the Social Democrats make their, quote, approval of the credits conditional on assurances as to the objectives of the war, end quote. Kautsky. In other words, the government should commit itself not to pursue aims of conquest, but only those of defense. Kautsky did not feel he could recommend an outright vote against the credits, quote, in view of the lack of clarity, end quote, about the exact responsibility for the war. Footnote. See the article Die Wahrheit über den 3rd of August, published in Vorwärts, 1st of January 1916. End footnote. Later, in his 1937 work, Socialisten und Krieg, Socialisten und Krieg, Kautsky maintained that the spirit of his position was that if the government refused to make such a commitment about the objectives of the war, war credits should be denied. Let's see if there's anything for this book online. The full description of the piece is titled, or the full name of the piece is Socialist and War, a contribution to the history of ideas of socialism from the Hussites to the League of Nations. Back to the text. When Kautsky's line was rejected and the parliamentary group divided into a majority that opposed asking for commitments from the government and a minority that opposed voting for the war credits under any circumstances, Kautsky argued successfully that the SPD's statement to the Reichstag explaining the party's affirmative vote should contain a sentence declaring that if the war assumed a character of conquest on Germany's part, social democracy would decisively oppose it. This sentence, however, was deleted from the text at the specific request of Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. Sorry, I want to look at this person, Bethmann Hollweg. Theobald von Bethmann Hollweg lived from 1856 to 1921 and was a German politician who was Imperial Chancellor of the German Empire from 1909 to 1917. Theobald von Bethmann Hollweg oversaw the German entry into World War I and played a key role during its first 3 years. He was replaced as Chancellor in July 1917 due in large part to opposition to his policies by leaders in the military. Between 1884 and 1899, Bethmann Hollweg rose rapidly through positions in the Prussian government and served briefly as a member of the Reichstag in 1890. The experience left him unsympathetic to the party system and independent for the remainder of his political life. Emperor Wilhelm II appointed Theodor von Bethmann Hollweg Chancellor in 1909, in part because he approved of his conciliatory political style. Bethmann Hollweg's 8 years as Chancellor showed Bethmann Hollweg to be cautiously supportive of some liberalization, but also a firm believer that a parliamentary monarchy was the best form of government for Germany. During World War I, Bethmann Hollweg thought that Germany was so threatened that it needed to take all necessary measures to survive. Bethmann Hollweg assured Austria-Hungary of Germany's full backing and supported its aggressive demands against Serbia. Bethmann Hollweg held back on German mobilization until after Russia's, so that Germany would not appear to be the aggressor. Although he supported the invasion of Belgium as necessary given Germany's threatened position, Bethmann Hollweg saw it from the first as an injustice that would need to be righted. Bethmann Hollweg fought against the implementation of unrestricted submarine warfare, but in the end bowed to pressure from the military and the conservatives in the Reichstag, and approved its use. As the war progressed, many who had supported him in Parliament felt that he had been in his position too long to be able to negotiate an acceptable peace. When both Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff and Chief of the General Staff Paul von Hindenburg threatened to resign if he was not replaced as Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg submitted his resignation to the Emperor. In his reflections on the World War that remained unfinished until he died in 1921, Bethmann Hollweg stressed Germany's difficult geographical position, admitted that the government and the emperor had made mistakes leading up to the war, and that Germany bore some of the guilt for it, but that only a, quote, common guilt could have led to such a great catastrophe. So that's Theodor von Bethmann Hollweg. Parenthesis, how close the, quote, intimacy of the imperial government and German social democracy had now become. Exclamation point, end parenthesis. Kautsky henceforth found himself thoroughly enmeshed in those distinctions between defensive and defensive war, which Kautsky had previously branded a source of confusion. Kautsky's attempted mediation came to nothing, as his well-known party discipline compelled Liebknecht to accept the decision of the majority on the 4th of August. But the session of the 3rd of August saw the onset of a process of political division within the SPD that was to become ever deeper. It was also the beginning of the isolation of Kautsky, who occupied a, quote, intermediary position, end quote, in which, as he later pointed out, he stood, quote, virtually alone. Kautsky's analysis of the war and the war's perspectives make it evident that his major objective was the re-establishment of conditions that would allow the party to resume the path that had been interrupted by the outbreak of hostilities. This attitude was closely linked to his assessment of imperialism. Since he did not believe that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism, and simultaneously maintained that the war would create grave difficulties for the European governments and ruling classes, and an economic decline of the continent, he held that the correct perspective was to direct the discontent of the masses towards the immediate attainment of democratic conquest and to renew the forward march of a strong working class towards power. In all his analyses, Kautsky constantly underscored four concomitant effects of the war. 1. The decline of Europe. 2. The rise of anti-imperialist struggles in the colonies. 3. The ascent of the United States, destined to assume the leadership of the capitalist world. 4. The end of Tsarist Russia. This was a global prospect of profound changes, but certainly not ones which would culminate in the international socialist revolution. On the 21st of August 1914, Kautsky published an article in Die Neue Zeit that drew all these essential elements together. Kautsky spoke of unprecedented geopolitical changes after the war, the decisive aspect of which would lie precisely outside Europe. The real victor in the war, he said, would inevitably be the United States, which would reap the greatest benefits. Quote, the reconstruction of the economic ruins of Europe after the war will be impossible without American aid. The defeated states, at least, will fall into a position of dependence on American finance capital. End quote. Did I say quote? There's a quote. Let me reread that. The real victor in the war, Kautsky said, would inevitably be the United States, which would reap the greatest benefits. Quote, the reconstruction of the economic ruins of Europe after the war will be impossible without American aid. The defeated states, at least, will fall into a position of dependence on American finance capital, end quote. The economic decline and financial ruin of Europe might well render it impossible to amass the great amounts of capital necessary for a new arms program, and so, quote, deprive imperialism, end quote, of its foundations, thus compelling by the force of circumstances that policy of international concord which had not been born of political choice. Turning to the situation in which the SPD found itself, Kautsky at least partially accepted the position of David, who insisted on the mission of the struggle against Tsarist despotism, parenthesis, as if this mission could be executed by the soldiers of the Kaiser, end parenthesis. Kautsky wrote that the positive side of the conflict, namely that it was a, quote, war against the Russian Tsar, end quote, was contradicted by the negative side, that it was a war, quote, also against the democracies of England and France, end quote. Whatever these contradictions, however, in practice, Kautsky spoke of the, quote, necessity of defending one's own homeland, end quote, while nevertheless noting that this task created a, quote, fatal dilemma between national loyalty and, quote, international solidarity. But such a dilemma, Kautsky argued, here Kautsky's fundamental preoccupation becomes evident, should not precipitate a division within the party. Hence, Kautsky's call for a unity above and beyond all differences, since a split would be, quote, fatal. Quote, in war, Kautsky wrote, quote, discipline is the first requisite, not only in the army, but also in the party, end quote. Quote, not criticism, but loyalty. Loyalty is the most important condition for our success today, end quote. Only thus could the most urgent task of the hour be accomplished, quote, to preserve the organizations and organs of the party and the trade unions intact, end quote, Kautsky. The summons to the left of the SPD, led by Liebknecht, Luxemburg, and Mering, to accept party discipline was patent. In all major articles Kautsky wrote during the second half of 1914, Kautsky developed these themes, attempting to moderate conflict within the party as much as possible and to concentrate on the resumption of its work once the war was over. Kautsky declared that discussion of the finance of the vote of the 4th of August 1914 could be fruitfully pursued as, quote, valid historical research only, quote, after the war, end quote. Footnote. Die Vorbereitung des Friedens. Neue Zeit. I guess that's volume 32. 1913 to 1914, volume 2. I don't know. Anyway, canceling any force to what he had called the, quote, dilemma between national defense and internationalist solidarity, Kautsky wrote in September 1914 that in reality there was no contradiction between the two terms. Indeed, the German Social Democrats and French Socialists, quote, without the slightest enmity towards their brothers across the border, end quote, had each voted for war credits in order to provide the means for the defense of their respective nations. Shortly thereafter, he wrote that once the war had actually begun, only one question remained, quote, victory or defeat. The possibility of working for, quote, the defeat of one's own homeland, end quote, Kautsky said, should be ruled out completely. The main problem was to ensure that defense was understood in terms of the democratic principles of the, quote, independence and territorial integrity of the nation, end quote, Kautsky. Since the war was an unaccomplished fact, the serious socialist parties should prepare a, quote, democratic peace, making sure that their own respective governments would not practice an imperialist and annexationist policy. Kautsky therefore recommended not Germany's, quote, isolation, but Germany's, quote, concord with the other world powers. This approach can be characterized as a fundamental conciliationism. Kautsky strove above all to combat any talk of the, quote, failure of the Second International. In a polemic against Mering, who had declared that the, quote, collapse of the International is a, quote, devastating fact of reality, Kautsky maintained that, on the contrary, quote, unity around principles remained. There was merely, quote, a diversity of conceptions, which could and should end as soon as the, quote, transitory situation that had generated it, end quote, ended. Indeed, Kautsky continued in an essay titled Die Internationalität und der Krieg, expressly devoted to defending the thesis that the International was not bankrupt. The facts demonstrated the correctness of its analyses. Quote, the outbreak of the war, Kautsky wrote, quote, signifies not the bankruptcy, but on the contrary, the confirmation of our theoretical conceptions, ... We have no regrets, nothing to revise. We feel decisively strengthened in the conceptions we upheld prior to the war, end quote. Kautsky argued that those who spoke of bankruptcy had expected something of the International. The International could never have produced. Quote, there are people, Kautsky said, referring to Luxemburg, Mering, and Liebknecht, quote, who claim that the International is bankrupt, since the International did not succeed in preventing the war, end quote. But in doing so, they, quote, demand from the International something that has never been seen in world history, that a party which is still too weak to conquer political power and determine the policies of states should be strong enough to prevent the inevitable consequences of these policies under all conditions, end quote. Kautsky. It should be noted that Kautsky was falsifying the positions of his opponents to some extent, since although it was true that the current of, quote, new radicals tended to underestimate the hold of chauvinism over broad layers of the masses, they had denounced the International and German social democracy, not for failing to prevent the war, but for not having struggled against the war, and primarily for having voted to grant the imperial government the credits with which to prosecute the war. Kautsky, for Kautsky's part, spoke not of bankruptcy, but merely of discovery of the objective limits of the International. What had disappeared was the expectation of a, quote, common position of the entire socialist proletariat, end quote. What the war had provoked was the division of socialists into, quote, different camps. The International, Kautsky concluded, quote, is unable to prevent, end quote, this division. Hence, Kautsky's assessment of the International is as an instrument of operative essentially during peacetime. Quote, it is not an effective instrument in war, but is essentially an instrument of peace, end quote. Quote, it can bring its full force to bear only in peacetime, end quote. And in war can act only, quote, to reconquer peace. Quote, to reconquer peace, end quote. Kautsky. Hence also the fact that, quote, the victory of the nation in war never constitutes an end in itself, but only a means by which to achieve a lasting peace, end quote. Kautsky. Thus the task of each party during the war was to, quote, struggle for peace, end quote. Peace would breathe new life into the International. Social democracy, Kautsky would say in March 1915, must struggle so that the end of the war would signify the opening of an era of internationalist peace, founded on mutual respect for the independence of nations. If international peace turned out to be impossible, if imperialism prevailed, then a second world war would be inevitable, as would the, quote, ruin of Europe for an entire historical period during which capitalism will continue to be viable, end quote. With the United States advancing from a position of leadership already consecrated by the First War to an even consecrated by the First World War to an even more complete dominance. Luxemburg issued a stinging and contemptuous reply to Kautsky, whom she called the, quote, theoretician of the swamp, end quote. Quote, the World Historical Call of the Communist Manifesto needs an essential amendment now, after the Kautskist correction, reads like this: workers of all countries, unite in time of peace and cut one another's throats in times of war, end quote. Where's the Luxemburg? According to Luxemburg, Kautsky's theory that the International was essentially an instrument of peacetime and, quote, not an effective instrument in wartime, end quote, would inaugurate, quote, a wholly new, quote, revision of historical materialism, compared to which all the past attempts of Bernstein appear as innocent child's play, end quote. Luxemburg. A revision that would culminate in petty bourgeois utopianism. Instead, it was necessary to demand the reconstruction of the International on the basis of a militantly anti-imperialist program, so that it would struggle against the present war from the revolutionary standpoint of the proletariat. Their differing interpretations of the function of the International now constituted the major front of conflict between the Kautskist and Luxemburgist conceptions. Luxemburg urged a strategy based on the action of the proletariat, whose task, Luxemburg said, must be to intervene in the crisis opened by the war, to promote a revolutionary and international break with capitalism. Kautsky's strategy, on the other hand, aimed at a democratic peace, seen as the precondition for a recovery of the International on the basis that had been shattered by the war. The Kautskist perspective was closely linked to a particular assessment of the nature of the war and the imperialism that generated it. In September 1914, Kautsky published in Die Neue Zeit an article titled Der Imperialismus, which presented the conclusions of the position he had expressed during the years immediately prior to the war. In an introductory note, Kautsky explained that the essay had been completed before the outbreak of hostilities, but had been brought up to date since. Behind its formerly theoretical guise, his analysis led to a series of concrete, tactical, and strategic consequences. He wrote, quote, does it, bracket, imperialism, end bracket, therefore constitute the ultimate possible expression of the world policy of capitalism, or is another possibility conceivable? In other words, does imperialism constitute the only remaining possible form of the expansion of exchange between industry and agriculture under capitalism, end quote. Kautsky. In responding to this question, Kautsky maintained that imperialism was only one specific way in which the capitalist countries resolved what was indeed a permanent necessity of capitalist development itself, to guarantee industry the agrarian hinterland from which to extract raw materials and foodstuffs. Kautsky supplied this definition of imperialism. Quote, imperialism is a product of highly developed industrial capitalism. Imperialism consists in the tendency of every capitalist industrial nation to subjugate and annex an ever larger agrarian area without regard to the nations inhabiting this area, end quote. Kautsky. One of the consequences of ever greater industrial development was that capitalism constantly modified the relationship between agriculture and industry to the detriment of the former, agriculture, and to the advantage of the latter, industry. This is why capitalism found it necessary to control an ever larger agrarian zone subject to intensified exploitation. The possibility of assuring this relationship within national boundaries led the capitalist countries to a systematic policy of subjugation of external zones. This, Kautsky emphasized, constituted an ineradicable economic exigency of capitalist development itself. But the proof that such a tendency was a vital prerequisite for capitalism did not at all demonstrate that any of the particular and specific forms it might assume constituted, quote, an irreplaceable necessity for the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Kautsky. Imperialism was just one of these specific forms. In the past, however, free trade had been another. Modern imperialism was born of the need for general control of industrial expansion. The export of capital, technology, and skilled labor, combined with the development of an infrastructure, railways, etc., in the subject territories themselves, had generated imperialist policies aimed at the creation of either colonies or of spheres of influence. Quote, these, Kautsky affirmed, quote, are the more important roots of imperialism, which has put an end to free trade, end quote. Kautsky held that the economic tendency of imperialism to subjugate territories that furnished raw materials was ineliminable. The only force that could block it was the political victory either of the proletariat in the developed countries or of the colonial peoples. Quote, the domination of the subjugated nations will come to an end only when these peoples or the proletariat of the industrialized capitalist countries become strong enough to throw off the capitalist yoke. This aspect of imperialism can be overcome only by socialism, end quote. Kautsky. But Kautsky observed, quote, imperialism also has another aspect, end quote. The political means by which imperialism sought to respond to the indispensable economic exigency of expansionism. The World War was the inevitable consequence of a specific type of response by particular large capitalist countries. Anarchic and unbridled military competition, burdening the entire economy, except those sectors profiting from arms production, with escalating and eventually unendurable costs. The irrationality of this imperialism could give rise to a bourgeois effort, supported by, quote, every capitalist able to look beyond the immediate moment, end quote, to resolve problems of output and market, not through mutually destructive conflicts, but through an appeal to general class interests. Kautsky imagined that the call of labor for international solidarity might in the future be matched by a call of capital, quote, capitalists of all countries unite, end quote. If capitalism persisted in the policy that had led to war, capitalism's end would become inevitable in an era of strife-ridden imperialism, since the system would then have proved incapable of expressing common international interest in a beneficial form. If, on the other hand, and this, Kautsky said, was still possible, since economically capitalism was viable so long as the extension of zones furnished raw materials under conditions of exploitation was not halted, in other words, provided that this process was not interrupted by the, quote, rising political opposition of the proletariat, end quote, capitalism were to renounce destructive conflicts and anarchic competition for raw materials, regulating the latter by a higher phase of international monopolism, then a new phase of capitalism was conceivable beyond the imperialist phase that had culminated in the First World War. This would be the phase of, quote, ultra-imperialism. Quote, from the purely economic standpoint, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, it is therefore not excluded that capitalism may yet experience a new phase, namely the transposition of the policy of the cartels to the realm of foreign policy. The transposition of the policy of the cartels to the realm of foreign policy. In other words, a phase of ultra-imperialism, which naturally we would have to combat as energetically as we combated imperialism, but the danger of which would take a different form, not a world arms race and threat to world peace, end quote. Kautsky.
Sorry about that long pause. During the first months of the war, Kautsky listed the following transformations of the world political scene that would inevitably result from the conflict. 1. The rise of the United States to the position of the world colossus of capital as a necessary consequence of the illusory struggle between England and Germany for domination of the world market. 2. The initiation of an anti-colonial struggle of vast and historic proportions. 3. The transformation of Tsarist Russia. But however great these changes, Kautsky was now convinced that the alternative, quote, imperialism or socialism, end quote, parenthesis, an alternative in which Kautsky had firmly believed in the past, end parenthesis, constitute a great oversimplification of the complexity of the real historical situation. In Kautsky's view, the reduction of capitalism to the policy of imperialism and the concomitant thesis that the workers' movement was facing either a revolution in the near future or an irremediable fall into nihilistic opportunism were equally false. Against such positions, Kautsky held that the proletariat should consider the possibility that the capitalist system might survive and undergo a transition to a higher form. The workers, therefore, had every reason to continue their progress towards ever greater maturity without falling into the embrace of either revolutionism or opportunism, options as radical as they were simplistic and politically destructive. On the other hand, while he denied that imperialism and the war would necessarily signify the objective and definitive ruin of capitalism in the short run, and therefore the necessity for a resolute revolutionary intervention, Kautsky was not prepared to conclude that the proletariat should renounce the struggle for socialism merely because it was possible that capitalism might have an ultra-imperialist future. On the contrary, Kautsky held that the objective basis for socialism coexisted with the possibilities of capitalist development, and that the question of the timeliness of socialism would be decided when the workers recovered democratic rights, when peace was reestablished, and when the International was constructed. In other words, under the conditions which had existed prior to the war, which alone could allow the proletariat to judge whether the subjective maturity of the socialist forces was sufficiently great for the exercise of power. In this regard, the polemic between Kautsky and Heinrich Kanov in the spring of 1915 is illuminating. Kanov maintained not only that imperialism constituted a necessary phase of capitalist development, but also that the very aggressivity of the imperialist powers demonstrated that the capitalist system was far from having exhausted its historic possibilities. Indeed, it was still in its, quote, youth. According to Kanov, the imperialist phase could not be considered as other than a historically progressive experience and an indispensable precondition for socialism. From this perspective, Kanov concluded that in both form and substance, imperialism was identical to capitalism itself, thereby rejecting Kautsky's thesis that imperialism was only one possible expression of capitalism. Kanov maintained positions from the right and that coincided with the position of the radicals on the left, except that he held that imperialist capitalism was on the rise, whereas the radicals maintained that imperialist capitalism was nearing imperialist capitalism's end. They agreed, however, in their common identification of capitalism and imperialism. Kautsky further developed his thesis on imperialism in the course of his reply to Kanov, distinguishing between, quote, type of policy and, quote, economic phase. Imperialism, Kautsky argued, was precisely the former rather than the latter. Kautsky then applied this distinction to the determination of the political attitude of the proletariat. Kanov had declared that to seek to eliminate imperialism in a period when the rule of capitalism was still unchallenged was to attempt to abstractly conjure away a necessary phase of economic development. Kautsky retorted that precisely because imperialism constituted a contingent and not a necessary form of capitalist development, the proletariat could and should oppose imperialism. Did the proletariat, Kautsky asked, quote, have a specific policy of the proletariat's own to counterpose to that of finance capital, and therefore also to imperialism, end quote. Kautsky replied that the question of the necessity of imperialism would in no case be posed merely speculatively. Could in no case be posed merely speculatively, but only in the light of whether it was also necessary for the proletariat, in the sense that the proletariat's conditions of existence, were inevitably linked to the development of imperialism. That, Kautsky said, could be excluded because the antithesis between capital and labor was rooted in the permanence of exploitation and not in the particular political context of the exploitation itself. Kautsky charged that Konov's analysis was a mechanistic analysis. Konov still believed that the objective basis for socialism was the collapse of capitalism. Konov merely postponed the time of the advent of socialism, claiming that capitalism still had a long historical epoch in front of capitalism. In reality, Kautsky said, it was impossible to attempt through scientific methods to ascertain the exact moment of, quote, maturity and exhaustion of capitalism. But, quote, has it ever happened in history, ever once, that a mode of production fell into such ruin that it could no longer move forward, end quote. The proof of the maturity of socialism did not lie purely on the level of objective economic processes. It was determined by the subjective political movement unleashed by class conflicts. Of course, if economic development was insufficient, then the social democracy could not implement its political program. Socialism could triumph only on the basis of a sufficient development of the forces of production, combined with an inadequate level of maturity of the proletariat as a subjective agent. Quote, the precondition for the accomplishment of such a task is surely the availability of adequate productive forces. If these are lacking, social democracy will fail in the execution of social democracy's program, end quote. But the objective conditions for socialism existed in the capitalist countries. Modern technology could assure workers a sufficient wage while simultaneously reducing the working week. The necessary concentration of industry had been attained. Quote, in this respect, Kautsky wrote, quote, I maintain that we have already reached the historically necessary stage, ... I therefore maintain that the objective preconditions for socialism are present in the capitalist countries, end quote. This, however, was only one aspect of the question. The other was that of the, quote, subjective preconditions, which was more, quote, complicated, since it concerned not only objective economic forces, but also relations among social classes. It was the capacity of the proletariat to determine the shape of these relations to a greater or lesser degree that was the decisive index of whether or not a society was, quote, ripe for socialism. Quote, there are two trends, Kautsky wrote, quote, that become especially important, that of the sharpening of class contradictions and that of the moral bankruptcy of capitalism. The moral bankruptcy of capitalism is something different from capitalism's economic bankruptcy. I doubt whether the proletariat will ever allow the economic sort of bankruptcy to occur. The moral bankruptcy must occur rather earlier, end quote. Kautsky. Elsewhere, Kautsky asserted that Marx himself, quote, counted on growing crises, but not on a permanent difficulty in pursuing production at all, end quote. Indeed, according to Marx, quote, the capitalist mode of production was inevitably headed toward ruin, not because of the capitalist mode of production's economic impotence, but because the capitalist mode of production produced, quote, the capitalist mode of production's own gravedigger, end quote, the working class, end quote. Economic crises and depressions were powerful revolutionizing forces, not because of economic crises and depressions' mechanical effects, but because economic crises and depressions stimulated dissatisfaction and an awakening of consciousness that led to the formation of a revolutionary will. Hence Kautsky's conclusion, quote, what we expect on the basis of the Communist Manifesto is that the transition from capitalism to socialism will always be the political result of the conquest of political power by the proletariat. The conquest of political power by the proletariat, and not of the automatic collapse of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. During his polemic with Kunov, Kautsky explained in what way, quote, ultra-imperialism could check the rise in the strength of the proletariat, having posited that imperialism did not represent the objective end of capitalist development, and that the objective end of capitalist development, from the purely economic standpoint, could continue its course. Let me repeat that, I fucked it up. During his polemic with Kunov, Kautsky explained in what way, quote, ultra-imperialism could check the rise in the strength of the proletariat, having posited that imperialism did not represent the objective end of capitalist development, and that the latter, from the purely economic standpoint, could continue its course. Kautsky insisted that in order to remain in the saddle, capitalism would have to acquire new credibility in the eyes of the masses. This it could do only if it managed to put an end to the predominance of the sort of policy represented by imperialism. However, if finance capital succeeded in adopting a new course that eliminated imperialist conflicts and inaugurated an epoch of international bourgeois coordination, then it would be possible for capitalism to recover a certain prestige. Quote, if such an era of ultra-imperialism should come to pass, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, then it is possible that at least the trend toward the moral bankruptcy of capitalism could be temporarily mitigated, end quote. Kautsky. If, on the contrary, the imperialist trend prevailed, quote, a Second World War would become, quote, inevitable. Kautsky outlined the ultra-imperialist alternative like this, quote, in the event that an accord of nations, disarmament, and lasting peace are achieved, then the worst of the causes which are increasingly leading to the moral bankruptcy of capitalism before the war would recede. Naturally, the new phase of capitalism would soon inherently give rise to new vices, perhaps even worse than their predecessors, under the weight of which not only the proletariat, which must feel oppressed and exploited in any phase of capitalism, but also more neutral classes and layers would suffer. At the same time, ultra-imperialism, like the Manchester capitalism of the 1850s and 1860s, and the imperialism of the turn of the century, up to the international rise in prices, would initially usher in an era of new hopes and expectations within capitalism, end quote. This, however, did not mean that the, quote, moral bankruptcy of capitalism, quote, would be postponed for a long period, end quote. Kautsky. It should be noted that Kautsky's analysis of the perspectives of the proletariat during a possible era of, quote, ultra-imperialism contains certain persistent contradictions. For, on the one hand, Kautsky described ultra-imperialism as a sort of international collective capitalist planning based on a general agreement to exploit, quote, peacefully, the backward zones furnishing raw materials and foodstuffs. This, he said, would permit a recovery of capitalist prestige and thereby weaken the struggle of the working class, precisely because the success of socialism presupposed the, quote, moral disarmament, end quote, of capitalism as a system. On the other hand, the triumph of ultra-imperialism presumed the defeat of the imperialist line, and therefore of the block of national finance capital and militarism within the bourgeoisie. This would be possible only if bourgeois contradictions sharpened and the proletariat helped to defeat the imperialist tendencies. In other words, if the proletariat won great successes in the proletariat's defense of democratic conquests within existing institutions and in the mobilization of the proletariat's international organization. Thus, ultra-imperialism was depicted simultaneously as the maximum of capitalist power and the maximum of the proletariat's capacity to bend the bourgeoisie in a non-imperialist direction. This contradiction was never resolved. In either case, Kautsky held that imperialism was the greatest enemy of the proletariat in the sense that the definitive consolidation of imperialism would signify ruin for all the social classes in struggle. In other words, for society as a whole. Kautsky had now moved far from his past positions, when he had believed that the result of a world war would be socialism. His new sense of resilience of capitalist development undermined his previous convictions and led him to believe that there was no future for any class on the basis of common social ruin. For him, imperialism meant such general ruin. The task of the proletariat was thus to struggle to break out of the imperialist tragedy, to foster an era of internal peace, and to intervene in capitalist contradictions, in a context of economic, social, and political normality. The price of this normality might be passage through an epoch of ultra-imperialism, whose general form would represent the conversion of free competitive capitalism into concord among states, betokening a new upswing in the productive forces in the framework of international disarmament, economic reorganization in various countries, and democracy as an internal method of regulating political and social relations. Imperialism as general ruin, and the absurdity of the notion that revolution could be, quote, grafted onto a society in ruins, such were Kautsky's leitmotifs in 1917. Quote, should we raise the slogan, prosecute... Did I say that? Did I say... Oh, no. Sorry, let me repeat that last sentence. Imperialism as general ruin, and the absurdity of the notion that revolution could be, quote, grafted onto a society in ruins, such were Kautsky's leitmotifs in 1917. Quote, should we raise the slogan, prosecution of the war until the social revolution, end quote? Kautsky asked. Quote, this would mean prosecution of the process of annihilation of both capital and labor until the complete ruin of capitalism, end quote. Kautsky, such a course would bankrupt the heirs of capitalism and nullify their inheritance, quote, a sure method of annihilating capitalism but also of rendering socialism impossible, end quote. What social democracy needed was peace, which would, quote, provide a terrain enabling the proletariat to intervene powerfully in future struggles, as it is doing in war and as it did before the war, end quote. Kautsky. It would be hard to find words in more explicit contradiction with the position of Engels, which even Kautsky had cited in the past, and which Lenin was now constantly recalling, that a great European war would mark the end of capitalism and the advent of socialism as a governing force. Kautsky's real appeal throughout the war was for a return to the road that had been interrupted in August 1914. Kautsky's conviction that the resumption of the strategy of the past was not only possible, but inevitable, rested on the central theoretical premise that democracy, understood as the, quote, participation of the popular masses in state policy, in institutions, end quote, represented the necessary political reflection of the indispensable economic role of the proletariat in production as an essential element of the modern capitalist system, quote, this development, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, that is, the expansion of modern democracy and of the strength of the proletariat, is as necessary a product of the capitalist mode of production as the effort of particular capitalist strata to extend the boundaries of their national state. Now the tendency towards democracy expands more the popular masses within the modern state under all circumstances, while the tendency towards the extension of the state is of interest to capital only under specific historical conditions. End quote. Hence Kautsky rebuked those who, quote, see only imperialism in the modern state and not the necessity of democracy, taking this necessity in all senses of the term, both as an unrenounceable demand of the proletariat, and as the inevitable product of the, quote, laws of motion of capitalist production itself, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy, Kautsky continued, grew incessantly with these laws, quote, despite all the obstacles that may arise temporarily, end quote. The power of democracy as a contemporary reality was such that it could be felt even during the World War itself. This was, quote, not only a struggle among different imperialisms, but also between imperialism and democracy, between more or less democratic states and more or less imperialist and militarist states, end quote. Kautsky expected that the end of the war would bring the bankruptcy of imperialism and a, quote, powerful advance of democracy, even though not yet the complete victory of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Internally, Kautsky expected that the end of the war, with the war's, quote, lessons, of the disastrous results of imperialism would see a strengthening of democracy. Internationally, Kautsky believed that a new spirit would lead to a society of nations, which Kautsky deemed the precondition for the establishment of freedom of commerce and trade, an expansion of the forces of production, and a renunciation of imperialist rivalry. There were strong similarities between Kautsky's perspective and various features of the pre-war program of Bernstein. In his 1915 work, Nationalstaat, Imperialistischer Staat, and Staatenbund, Kautsky declared that the far right and far left of the party were committing the same error, although from opposite points of view. I'm not seeing a description for that book. The far right and far left both believe that, quote, imperialism constitutes a necessity for the present mode of production, end quote. This, quote, coincidentia oppositorum, end quote, also made their positions interchangeable. The extremists of the right were prepared to support imperialism. Those of the left sought to bring down imperialism, abandoning the task of propaganda for socialism by trying to introduce socialism immediately. But it was no accident that on the basis of the common thesis that imperialism was, quote, inevitable, those who lost faith in the, quote, immediate practical introduction of socialism, end quote, ended up in the ranks of the zealots of imperialism. Parenthesis. One striking example of such a transformation was the case of Paul Lynch, who, after supporting the radical positions on imperialism, became pro-imperialist in the course of the war. End parenthesis. Wikipedia says Paul Lynch lived from 1873 to 1926. Paul Lynch was a war journalist, editor, author of several books, and politician in the SPD. From 1912, Lynch was a member of the German Reichstag for the SPD, and in 1919, Paul Lynch became professor of economics at Berlin University. Back to the text. Kautsky now sketched out a rapid analysis of the historical phases of capitalist development and their relation to imperialism. The latter, he observed, whose, quote, characteristic is the union of finance capital with industrial capital, end quote, superseding that period in which the modern economy received its vital dynamism from industrial capital, with its tendencies toward, quote, peace among peoples, limitation of the absolute power of the state through parliamentary and democratic institutions, and a policy of frugality in state budgets, end quote, with its hostility towards tariffs on food products and raw materials, end quote, parenthesis, except for a temporary inclination toward protective industrial tariffs during its infancy, end parenthesis. Under the catalytic pressure of the trusts and the centralization of the big banks, the primacy of industrial capital had been replaced by that of finance capital, unifying the two forms of capital and directly subjugating the state. Quote, the state orientation of finance capital, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, is now rising to the level of a general orientation of all the economically dominant classes of the advanced capitalist countries, end quote. The power block welded by finance capital and militarism was playing out its hand in the World War. If capitalism was unable to find a new direction, once the conflict was over, it would fall into a, quote, chronic condition of warfare, end quote. Having arrived at this point, Kautsky explained what Kautsky meant by, quote, capitalism of a new age of reason, end quote. Kautsky insisted that peace and democracy at home and abroad would serve capitalist economic development better than imperialism. The road that capitalism could travel most effectively, Kautsky claimed, was not that of military conquest, but of regulated, negotiated expansion based on free trade and the international division of labor. But an industrious and pacific international exchange of wealth demanded the replacement of, quote, war of all against all, end quote, by agreement between states through international organizations and a spiritual reformation of nations. Quote, in the future, the best and most fruitful means of extending the internal market lies not in the extension of the national state in the direction of the formation of a multinational state, but in the union of diverse national states with equal rights into a league of states. The League of States and not the nation-state or the colonial state constitutes the shape of the great empires needed by capitalism to realize capitalism's ultimate highest form within which the proletariat can assume power. The League of States and not the national state or the colonial state constitutes the shape of the great empires needed by capitalism to realize its ultimate highest form within which the proletariat can assume power, end quote. Kautsky thus identified the highest stage of capitalism not with imperialism but with ultra-imperialism. Hence Kautsky's programmatic reaffirmation of the value of the democratic method, understood as the parliamentary method, that would bring the proletariat to power. Kautsky maintained was not revolutionary. What would bring the proletariat to power, Kautsky maintained, was not revolutionary violence pitted against the violence of imperialism, but the peaceful increase in the strength of the proletariat within representative democratic institutions. So long as economic and social development was dominated by capitalism, the task of social democracy could only be to struggle for its own organizational autonomy and to support those bourgeois and petty bourgeois layers that resisted the, quote, policy of imperialism, end quote. Social democracy could not act according to the precept of, quote, the worse the better, end quote. Social democracy could not take the position that the working class had an interest in curbing economic development just because this development was occurring in the form of capitalism. It was the duty of social democracy, Kautsky wrote, quote, to defend the interests of the proletariat against capitalism, to combat capitalism, but also and at the same time to favor economic development, even though this development will necessarily express itself as capitalist progress so long as society is not organized in a socialist manner, end quote. This progress, when it occurred in the political and institutional forms of democracy, constituted the best basis for the, quote, physical, spiritual, and political, end quote, strengthening of the proletariat. Kautsky's postulation of the alternative of a catastrophic continuation of imperialism or a, quote, ultra-imperialist phase, either a new triumph of the bloc of finance capitalism and militarism or a reassertion of rationalizing and democratic tendencies within capitalism, led him to seek a strategy of alliances between the non-imperialist sectors of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This amounted to a continuation of the policy he had advocated during the last years of peace before 1914. If imperialism was characterized by the subjugation of industrial capital by finance capital, Kautsky said, then it was necessary to strive to end this subjugation and to break its reactionary and militaristic framework. In a 1914 essay, Der Imperialistische Krieg, Kautsky dealt thoroughly with this aspect of proletarian strategy, jettisoning the position expounded in Der Weg zur Macht, that imperialism was welding all non-socialist forces into a reactionary mass. Kautsky now maintained that the war and the war's, quote, lessons would tend to create growing contradictions within the bourgeoisie and the other non-proletarian social strata. The capitalists, quote, do not at all form a compact mass. The interests of the capitalists and industry are in no way identical to those of the finance capitalists or even the landlords. There are these are differences and contradictions even among the industrial capitalists themselves, but heavy industry and the textile industry, There are differences and contradictions even among the industrial capitalists themselves, between heavy industry and the textile industry, for example, end quote. In addition, there were the intellectuals who possessed no class unity, and there were the, quote, older classes, end quote. Given this multiplicity of interests and their political implications, quote, the proletariat cannot be indifferent to the question of which enemies it must confront, or to the manner in which the mutual struggles of the other classes are resolved. The proletariat must study their contradictions and must intervene in these struggles consciously and deliberately. Otherwise, social democracy will remain, as long as social democracy does not command a majority, a, quote, powerless minority, end quote, exactly as Engels said, end quote. Kautsky claimed that only a perspective of this sort would allow the proletariat to intervene, quote, in all contemporary struggles, end quote, and that this was the tactical and strategic substance of the, quote, centrism of Marx and Engels. Where am I? I lost my spot. Since imperialism, quote, is not a necessity for the development of industrial production in the context of the rule of capitalism, but only one of the means by which super profits are obtained, end quote, since the prosecution of imperialist goals was a, quote, question related to the strength of the classes that have no direct interest in imperialism, end quote. The common problem of these classes was to prevent the pursuit of imperialist policies. In the future, Kautsky observed, might see a juxtaposition of the international unification of imperialism against the proletarian international. Quote, it is not at all out of the question, end quote. Kautsky wrote, quote, that the present war could end in such a way that the imperialists of the leading great powers of both camps arrive at an agreement to divide and exploit the world. Yes, we must even consider the possibility that the world we may see the spectacle, shameful for us, of the realization of the international of the imperialists before that of the international of the socialist parties. Naturally, an imperialist understanding is not what we strive for. What we need is understanding among peoples, above all the proletariat, under the leadership of the Socialist International. The Imperialist International can bring peace, even a secure peace under certain conditions, but in that event the exploitation of peoples by unified international finance capital will become more gigantic and better planned. Nevertheless, the resistance of the proletariat should then emerge ever more powerfully, for the international class struggle of the proletariat would no longer be obfuscated and hampered by national differences of any sort. It is not our intention to prophesy. Today it is absolutely impossible to predict what the outcome of the war will be. An international intent of the imperialists is only one of the many possible conclusions to the present conflict, end quote. Kautsky. Developing Kautsky's analysis of the relationship between social classes and imperialism, Kautsky asserted that while the growing dangers of imperialism provoked contradictions within classes other than the proletariat, so long as imperialism retained imperialism's power, imperialism tended to forge a general reactionary bloc that absorbed even sectors of the proletariat itself. If imperialism were really the, quote, last word of capitalism, end quote, Kautsky wrote, then, quote, we would be dealing with a reactionary mass as a durable and not a transitory phenomenon. It would remain until socialism came to power and put an end to class differences once and for all, end quote. Kautsky evoked this possibility, but Kautsky's own conviction was that, quote, the policy of imperialism will fall into bankruptcy even before capitalism, end quote. Kautsky. The prospect of a, quote, reactionary mass becoming a reality as an anti-socialist front was linked, Kautsky argued, to the contingency of capitalism failing to supersede capitalism's imperialist phase. In that event, the various non-proletarian strata, for all their undeniable real or potential contradictions, would plunge into a decisive historic crisis, and the conflicts between the bourgeoisie and the socialist proletariat would become so sharp as to provoke a situation that would tend to forge a block of, quote, all the opponents of socialism, end quote. Quote, an unexpected increase in the strength of socialism to a point where it is perceived as a threat by bourgeois society as a whole could lead to the formation of a reactionary mass, end quote. It is well known, of course, that Kautsky's theory of imperialism and ultra-imperialism was subjected to a violent and disdainful critique by Lenin in Lenin's work of 1916, Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism. In the July 1920 preface to a new edition of this study, Lenin described Kautsky's theories as, quote, the complete renunciation of those same revolutionary principles of Marxism that writer has championed for decades, end quote. Lenin. The political substance of this apostasy was an opportunism designed to, quote, obscure the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, end quote. Conceiving of imperialism as the, quote, culminating historical phase, end quote, of capitalism, and as capitalism's, quote, decay, Lenin argued that Kautsky's prediction of a stage subsequent to imperialism amounted to an outright political betrayal. Denying the equivalence between the crisis of imperialism and socialist revolution, an inevitable result was to disarm the proletariat and deprive the proletariat of the necessary determination in the revolutionary struggle for the overthrow of capitalism and the conquest of political power. In examining Lenin's riposte, it is noticeable that Lenin's polemical zeal led Lenin to oversimplify Kautsky's theses seriously, robbing Kautsky's theses of some of Kautsky's theses' essential features. First of all, in disputing Kautsky's definition of imperialism, Lenin denounced Kautsky's definition of imperialism's falsity in terms so harsh that Lenin claimed that Kautsky ignored the fact that, quote, imperialism is, in general, a striving towards violence and reaction, end quote. Lenin. That, quote, the characteristic feature of imperialism is not industrial, but finance capital, end quote. Lenin. In reality, as we have amply seen, Kautsky was not at all unaware of the connection between imperialism on the one hand and violence and reaction on the other. On the contrary, Kautsky emphasized that violence was a product of the dangerous policies of imperialism, since the policies of imperialism had the twofold tendency to consolidate reaction at home and to create zones of commercial influence and economic exploitation abroad, in contradiction with the principles of free trade. Likewise, Kautsky was scarcely unaware of the connection between finance capital and imperialism. For Kautsky attributed the triumph of imperialism precisely to the domination of finance capital over capitalist society as a whole. Thus, when Lenin cited Kautsky's definition of imperialism as, quote, a product of highly developed industrial capitalism, end quote, as proof that Kautsky had failed to understand the role of finance capital, he was viewing the definition formalistically. In fact, Kautsky's reference to, quote, industrial capitalism in this quotation was clearly intended to refer to capitalism in general in the epoch of contemporary industrialism, so much so that when he drew a distinction between, quote, industrial capitalism and, quote, finance capitalism, Kautsky assigned the former a position subordinate to the latter in the epoch of imperialism. And when Kautsky posited the hypothesis of a non-imperialist evolution, Kautsky did so by postulating a division between the two components. Similarly, it appears that when Lenin cited the passage in which Kautsky wrote that the imperialist industrial countries sought to resolve the problem of raw materials by annexing, quote, all large areas of agrarian territory, end quote, in order to show that his opponent remained imprisoned in a conception of imperialism confined to the schemata of the old colonialism, Lenin was misrepresenting Kautsky's positions. What Kautsky meant to assert, parenthesis, as is quite unequivocal in the very passages Lenin himself cites repeatedly and extensively on other points, end parenthesis, was that the general tendency of the imperialist powers to seek reservoirs of raw materials and food in territories outside Europe constituted the most striking manifestation of the conflict among the great powers competing for general economic domination. Kautsky indisputably related imperialism, 1, to finance capital, and 2, to the attempts of finance capital to alter the relationship of forces and economic systems of the great states. Kautsky did not ignore the tendency of imperialist powers to annex even metropolitan territories wrenched away from their rivals. Here is what Kautsky wrote in Serbien und Belgien in der Geschichte, published in 1917. Quote, imperialism furnishes a scientific explanation of the present war only when imperialism is regarded as the phenomenological product of a specific type of capitalism, namely, quote, finance capitalism, end quote. In the preceding period of capitalism, during which industrial capital dominated in more simple forms, the bourgeoisie was oriented in a liberal direction and aspired to the national state. In the period of imperialism, it abandons liberalism and seeks to expand beyond the confines of the national state through the annexation of territories which are deprived of rights or held in conditions of inferiority, colonies or protectorates. When two highly developed capitalist states plunge into struggle over the annexation of the same territory, one may speak of a purely imperialist war, end quote. Kautsky. The real substance of the theoretical and political conflict between Kautsky and Lenin must be sought primarily in the views of the future of capitalism as a social system. For Lenin, the historic necessity of the revolution and the duty to struggle to transform the imperialist war into a civil war, and therewith into a socialist seizure of power, flowed from his analysis not only of imperialism in general, but also of the First World War in particular, as the expression of a comprehensive crisis of capitalism, whose ultimate stage was now prey to parasitism. One of the key theses of this analysis was that only revolutionary violence could provide an effective response to the now systematic and permanent violence of the imperialist ruling classes. For Kautsky, on the other hand, the historical situation left open various possibilities. Capitalism had not necessarily reached capitalism's end. It is significant that Kautsky's first comments on the imperialist war took the form of a prediction of the decadence of Europe and of a great future for the youthful capitalism of the United States. Kautsky's emphasis on the possibility of a, quote, ultra-imperialist phase of capitalism, of the constitution of an international of capitalist countries united together to exploit the world, explained why he refused to view the outcome of the war in terms of the exclusive alternative, imperialism or socialism in the near future, an alternative which, by declaring imperialism to be the definitive crisis of capitalism, made the social revolution the sole task of the hour. Moreover, while Lenin called for civil war and revolutionary violence, Kautsky rejected such a call. Kautsky had always rejected such a call, even during the years when Lenin nevertheless called Kautsky a genuine Marxist, because Kautsky was persuaded that the only basis for the construction of socialism was the parliamentary conquest of the state machine. Kautsky was convinced that this machine was a technical instrument that could be submitted to democratic controls and oriented to new purposes. In this respect, Kautsky's position was radically different from that of Marx in Marx's writings on the Paris Commune, but not replaced or shattered by the assault of the mass movements, as Pannekoek had maintained in the polemic of 1912. All this led Kautsky to a strategy of democratic parliamentary struggle for a majority within existing representative institutions. In the last few years before the World War, Kautsky had begun to vacillate at the superior resistance demonstrated by capitalism, losing his confidence in any rapid or proximate victory over it. Kautsky reacted by increasingly retreating to respect for democratic parliamentary rules as the only permanently valid measure of the real relations among classes and of the maturity of the proletariat. Since the proletariat had been too weak to prevent the outbreak of the war, it was still less capable of opposing that war by semi-revolutionary or revolutionary methods once it had broken out. Similarly, Kautsky concluded that the sole basis for socialist victory was a demonstration of proven political will and maturity. A working class too weak to defend democracy should have no illusion that working class could seize power by the shortcut of violence. Such an illusion would merely represent a sectarian political and social immaturity whose price, if a violent road were actually attempted, would inevitably be an inability to administer society. There is no doubt that Kautsky's delineation of, quote, ultra-imperialist future for capitalism. Let me repeat that whole sentence. There is no doubt that Kautsky's delineation of a, quote, ultra-imperialist future for capitalism, although based on a realistic awareness of the further possibilities of development of the reigning system, was politically incoherent and contradictory. For on the one hand, Kautsky spoke of an internationally unified capitalism and a rejuvenation of capitalist prestige, in sum a fortification of the capitalist mode of production. On the other hand, Kautsky seemed unable to draw the political conclusions from this prospect and imagined that such a process would be fully compatible with a utopian degree of international peace. With the restoration of parliamentary democracy and the strengthening of the united energies of the socialist proletariat. The contradiction was rooted in his overestimation of the power of the nexus between the economic and political roles of the proletariat. Kautsky remained convinced that the economic importance of the working class was sufficient to guarantee political democracy in the state and allied institutions. That is, the regulation of relations between classes by the, quote, democratic method, apart from contingent episodes of reaction. Kautsky seemed to have no suspicion that a, quote, ultra-imperialist phase might instead take the form of a general trend towards a bureaucratic accentuation of capitalist oppression and a progressive debilitation of the political representatives of the socialist parties in parliament. New section. The birth of the USPD. Kautsky's attitude towards the, quote, domestic truce, end quote, between the SPD and the German government after the 4th of August 1914, and to the, quote, defense of the fatherland, end quote, was meanwhile progressively shifting towards active criticism of the party majority, which gave nearly complete support to the government. Kautsky did not, however, share the attitude of Liebknecht, who had initially bowed to party discipline, and thus voted for the war credits on the 4th of August 1914, against his will, but then, on the 2nd of December 1914, was the only member of the Reichstag to vote against another grant of war credits, thus defying the instructions of the party. Kautsky supported the centrist opposition of Haase and Ledebour, who changed their position as the illusion of a war of defense collapsed, and on the 20th of March and 20th of August 1915 abstained on war credit votes, while intensifying their criticism of the oppressive internal regime within Germany. Let's see if I can find anything for these people. Haase. Wikipedia says Hugo Haase lived from 1863 to 1919 and was a German socialist politician, jurist, and pacifist. With Friedrich Ebert, he co-chaired the Council of the People's Deputies during the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919. And Ledebour. Georg Ledebour lived from 1850 to 1947 and was a German socialist politician and journalist. It looks like he had a romantic relationship with Luz Salome, who's was the woman that Nietzsche was in love with. Kautsky supported the centrist opposition of Haase and Ledebour, who changed their position as the illusion of war of defense collapsed, and the 20th of March and 20th of August 1915 abstained on war credit votes, while intensifying their criticism of the oppressive internal regime within Germany. The difference between the opposition of Liebknecht and that of the quote centrist was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. Liebknecht considered the demand for peace without annexations, the main slogan of the quote centrists, utopian. Liebknecht's line became increasingly radical, calling for agitation against the war as such, while the quote centrists opposed the quote domestic truce in order to dissuade the government from its imperialist objectives. The centrist strategy was designed to bring about a return to the pre-war situation. The conflict between Liebknecht's position and those of the more moderate quote centrists became evident on the 15th of June, in June 1915. On the 9th of June, the radical oppositionists presented the party executive and parliamentary group with a document drawn up on the basis of a draft by Liebknecht himself, which denounced both the imperialist character of the war and the complicity of the SPD deputies with the government. The policy initiated on the 4th of August 1914, it declared, represented the beginning of a line that meant, quote, not only the bankruptcy of the party, end quote, at a moment of historic crisis, but also, quote, an ever graver break with our previous principles, end quote. Charging that it was becoming, quote, ever clearer, end quote, that the character of the war was one of, quote, imperialist conquest, end quote. It called for respect for the resolutions of the Stuttgart Congress of the International in 1907, which committed every party to exploit a war for purposes of class struggle and to work to, quote, bring the war to an end as quickly as possible, end quote. Finally, the document denounced the fact that the, quote, Reichstag fraction, of which the majority of the leaders of the party are members, has abandoned opposition to the policy of imperialist conquest, end quote. On the 19th of June, 1915, just 10 days after the 9th of June manifesto, Bernstein, who had joined the, quote, centrists because of his disagreement with the majority's support of the war, Haase and Kautsky published a manifesto of their own in which they denounced German plans, as set out in a document submitted by major consortia to Chancellor Bettman Holvig on the 20th of May for colonial expansion, war reparations, and the annexation of various European territories, parenthesis, inhabited by more than 7 million Belgians and 3 million French, end parenthesis. More moderate than the signatories of the 9th of June Manifesto, who had called the vote of the 4th of August the beginning of a degeneration of German social democracy. Bernstein, Haase, and Kautsky, on the contrary, recalled the declaration of the SPD Reichstag caucus on the 4th of August, opposing any war of conquest or aggressive policy of imperialist circles. I want to see if there's anything for 9th of June Manifesto. There's like any kind of additional information on that. I'm not seeing anything. Back to the text. This document, Das Gebot der Stunde, counterposed popular, quote, desire for peace, end quote, to the evils of war. It called upon social democracy to fulfill its duty to voice the general desire to put an end to the massacres and to oppose the policies of annexation and imperialism. The manifesto concluded by emphasizing the potential division between the majority and the opposition in the SPD. Quote, if our party does not have the strength to take the necessary decisions, then it is incumbent upon us to come forward as the advocates of the policy we have characterized as the correct one, end quote. It was significant that Bernstein, Haase, and Kautsky not only referred positively to the spirit in which the SPD had voted for war credits in August 1914, but also that, unlike the signers of the 9th of June Manifesto, they avoided mention of any necessity to intensify the class struggle within the country because of the situation created by the prolongation of the war. Kautsky in particular viewed the evolution of relations between the majority and the two oppositions, parenthesis, the quote, centrist opposition and the opposition grouped around Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and parenthesis, in the light of Kautsky's growing concern at the, quote, breakdown of the unity of the party caused by the two extremes, the pro-government wing of the Davids and the trade union leaders on the one hand, and the intransigent revolutionary oppositionists on the other. In a letter to Victor Adler dated 28th of November 1914, Kautsky had once again defended his 3rd of August 1914 position on the war credits, parenthesis, i.e. a recommendation to vote in favor of the government if the government declared itself against annexations and the infringement of the rights of other peoples, otherwise to abstain, end parenthesis. Kautsky viewed Liebknecht's vote against the war credits as not only ineffective but even, quote, ridiculous. Most of all, Kautsky feared it could become the, quote, point of departure for a split, end quote. The other group, David, Heine, Sudacum, and other union leaders, he continued, were also working, quote, against their own will, end quote, for a split. The Heine being referred to appears to be referring to Wolfgang Heine, who lived from 1861 to 1944. Wolfgang Heine was a German jurist and social democratic politician. Wolfgang Heine was a member of the Imperial Parliament and the Weimar National Assembly. Wolfgang Heine served as Minister-President of the Free State of Anhalt and Prussian Minister of the Interior and Justice. Who was the other person? Sudacum. This appears to be referring to an Albert Sudicum, who lived from 1871 to 1944. He was a German journalist and politician, a supporter of reformism. He advocated an alliance with the party of the bourgeoisie. And David refers to Edward David. Edward Heinrich Rudolf David lived from 1863 to 1930. Edward David was a German politician. Edward David was an important figure in the history of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, and of the German political labor movement. After the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, he was a minister without portfolio in the government of Philip Scheidemann before becoming Minister of the Interior in June 1919, the succeeding government headed by Gustav Bauer. Edward David remained in that position until October of that year. Edward David was also briefly the first president of the Weimar National Assembly, which drew up the Weimar Constitution and ratified the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Back to the text. Kautsky expressed, the other group, David, Heine, Sudicum, and the union leaders, Kautsky continued, were also working, quote, against their own will, end quote, for a split. Kautsky expressed concern for the difficult position in which the, quote, center found the center's self, to the extent that the center did not oppose the right. The center facilitated the shift of a portion of the working class to the, quote, Luxembourg group, while to the extent that it did oppose the right, it appeared as composed of, quote, people who differ from Rosa Luxemburg only in their lack of courage, end quote. Kautsky. A few months later, on the 11th of February 1915, shortly before the attack by Haza and Ledebour on the government's policy in March, Kautsky wrote another letter to Adler in which Kautsky suggested that the greater share of the responsibility for a possible split now rested with the right. Quote, our unity is not increasing, end quote. Kautsky wrote, but, quote, but diminishing. Some months ago it still seemed that the greater danger to unity came from the left, from the, quote, followers of Rosa, end quote. Today it is coming from the right, the people grouped around Edward David, and the trade union leaders believe that the time has come to purge the party of any, quote, Marxism. ... Naturally, what the group around David want is not a split, but their domination over the entire apparatus of the party and our reduction to the position of mute figureheads. On the other hand, I am not working for a split either, but the conflicts are becoming more exasperating every day, and one fine day there might be an ultimatum that would make war inevitable, ... We must be prepared for the harshest internal struggles, ... Hitherto I have been counseling peace in the party so far as I have been able. Now I can no longer do so, end quote. Kautsky, in a letter to Victor Adler. In the same letter, Kautsky spoke of the, quote, terrorism the right was introducing into the party. It is clear from yet another letter to Adler that Kautsky, while apprehensive of the effects of a split in the party, was also eyeing the rising opposition to the line of the right that was developing in the party and in the parliamentary caucus. Torn between fear of a split and awareness that internal opposition was growing because of the errors of the right, Kautsky strove to infuse the party with a conception of discipline that would not be so rigid as to prevent the expression of dissent. The fact that, quote, grave conflicts had arisen in the party was certainly not positive, Kautsky observed, but, quote, once such conflicts exist, confronting those conflicts freely is the only way to alleviate the evil, end quote. If it was impossible to, quote, make propaganda for what one considered just, then party membership became, quote, an intolerable constraint, end quote. Kautsky. Quote, what endangers the party is not the expression of the conflict, but the conflict's existence. What endangers the party is not the expression of the conflict, but the conflict's existence, end quote. Kautsky. In practice, this appeal for tolerance was doomed to complete failure by the progressive exacerbation of the internal conflicts within the SPD. On the 1st of January 1916, the, quote, International Group, i.e. the Spartacist wing of the party opposition grouped around Liebknecht, Luxemburg, and Mering, in other words, the far left, organized a national conference in Berlin with a platform denouncing the official party line and criticizing the weakness of the, quote, centrists. The SPD leadership replied by expelling Liebknecht from the parliamentary caucus on the 12th of January. Kautsky spoke of the need for an agreement to salvage the unity of the party based on the abandonment of intolerance by the majority and the acknowledgement of the right of the minority to express its opposition publicly. Quote, we are in a situation in which every step the party takes is fraught with dangers, the greatest of which, end quote, threatening the entire party, was the, quote, minority remains mute, end quote, while, quote, only the majority continues to appear as the representative of the party, end quote. Kautsky. Quote, therefore, Kautsky wrote, quote, the existence of the party is at stake. To save the party, the minority must no longer allow itself to be excluded from the public scene, even though there is a danger that the majority may resort not only to the sharpest protest, which is to be expected, but even to acts of intolerance, end quote. Kautsky. On the other hand, Kautsky exhorted the minority not to act, quote, rashly. A further crucial development in the organizational schism within the party occurred in the parliamentary caucus on the 24th of March. The minority refused to vote in favor of the government. Haza motivated its negative vote by denouncing both the internal repression in the country and the government's imperialist objectives abroad. The majority of the parliamentary caucus decided by a vote of 58 to 33 to expel the entire minority from the caucus. The minority then formed a caucus of its own, the Arbeitsgemeinschaft. Its members were not yet expelled from the party itself, but by now the internal temperature had risen steeply. The background of the conflicts in the SPD was the constant deterioration in the living conditions of the masses, which had fallen precipitously. The conflict between the, quote, centrist and Spartacist oppositions was also acute. The former disagreed with the call for the formation of a new international and rejected the latter's inclination to constitute a separate party, transforming political opposition into organizational secession. Commenting on the division of the parliamentary caucus of the SPD, Kautsky gave political support to the oppositional Arbeitsgemeinschaft. In Kautsky's view, the organizational unity of the party was now experiencing its most dangerous crisis since the end of the emergency laws against the Social Democrats. Kautsky asserted that the majority bore the political responsibility for this, since it had turned the vote of 4th of August 1914 into the beginning of a, quote, new epoch that broke with the traditions and principles of the party. The Kolbs, Davids, and Heinas, exploiting votes in favor of the government and wartime emergency regulations, had increasingly forced through their own, quote, national social policy, creating an impossible situation for those who did not follow them. Nevertheless, Kautsky still sought to maintain a dialectical unity within the party. Although the responsibility for the events in the parliamentary caucus in March, he said, fell upon the majority, which had adopted a mechanical conception of self-discipline, which left no room for dissent. Both sides had to work together in the party. Quote, the intentions of the minority in no way incline toward the division of the party, and the very logic of events does not impel them to do this, end quote, he commented, revealing how little he had understood the connection that now existed between political ideological dissent and organizational questions. Quote, the conditions that caused the split of the parliamentary group, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, are rooted in the nature of parliament. These conditions do not obtain in our organizations, end quote. Within the SPD itself, the contest between the majority and the opposition could unfold without provoking a scission, provided the necessary space for political disagreement was assured within the party. Quote, if both parliamentary caucuses, end quote, Kautsky continued, quote, work side by side and not against each other, then the great organism of the party will not be shaken by the disputes of the two within the structure. But let us take care that this remains a struggle of convictions. The struggle over great principles elevates us, strengthens us, and increases our power of attraction among independent minds. Only a struggle based on personal deformation degrades the party and undermines its recruiting ability, end quote. Kautsky. In effect, even after the split of the parliamentary caucus, Kautsky still sought to insist that the traditional manner in which the party had regulated internal conflicts in the past remained valid. Such a line, possibly viable in peacetime, was wholly inadequate to a situation where the masses were becoming increasingly radicalized by the sufferings of the war. While those whom Kautsky called the, quote, National Socialists rallied fulsomely to the imperial government, the tensions in the party could no longer be controlled by mere declarations of tolerance. From the spring of 1916 onwards, there was a sharp deterioration in the situation. On the 1st of May, Liebknecht was arrested and later sentenced to imprison after a demonstration in Berlin. The movement of strikes and demonstrations, despite obstruction from collaborationist social democrats, intensified throughout the country. Luxemburg and Mering were soon arrested as well. The government tightened police surveillance of the working class. In these conditions, Kautsky realized that the appeal of the opposition was spreading irresistibly. His main concern was to prevent it being captured by the Spartacists. In a letter to Victor Adler, dated 7th of August 1916, he wrote that the question was now sounding, quote, is the party to act as a government party or an opposition party, end quote. Explaining his attitude toward Liebknecht, he noted that the sufferings of the popular masses, quote, are producing mounting irritation and exasperation, and what is called, quote, radicalism is spreading as a result. It is too early to tell whether the majority of the party now supports the opposition. What is certain is that a great number of symptoms show that it, bracket, the opposition, end bracket, is growing. The question is not if, but what sort of opposition will win? The sort that wants to destroy the party or the sort that wants to become the majority within the party? The danger from the, quote, Spartacus group is great. The Spartacus group's radicalism corresponds to the immediate needs of the broad, undisciplined masses. Liebknecht is now the most popular man in the trenches. This is universally confirmed by all those returning from the front. The dissatisfied masses understand nothing of Liebknecht's policy, but the dissatisfied masses see Liebknecht as the man who is working for an end to the war, and this is what counts for them. To the, quote, Spartacists, however, the growth of the opposition within the party appears too slow. Patience has never been their strong point. The Spartacists want to leave the party. This would be quite all right for a large portion of the right, especially the General Commission, bracket, of the trade unions, end bracket, and its little appendage, the party leadership. They too would like to see the opposition leave the party before it becomes the majority. The General Commission is playing the decisive leading role in this, while the party leadership is the indecisive sector, being dragged along, drawing back in face of the consequences of its own acts. Strange as it may seem, The Arbeitsgemeinschaft is the element still holding the party together in face of these two extremes. Had it not been formed, Berlin would have been conquered by the Spartacists and would be outside the party. On the other hand, if the left parliamentary group had been constituted in an independent position a year ago, as I desired, the Spartacus group would have acquired no weight at all. Kautsky. This letter is of critical importance for the light it sheds on Kautsky's attitude toward the National Socialists and the Spartacists. In it can be read the reasons for Kautsky's later support for the secession from the SPD in 1917. 1. Kautsky's conviction that the opposition was on the way to winning over the majority. 2. Kautsky's desire to confiscate the political leadership of the opposition from the radicals. 3. Kautsky's effort to preserve the unity of the bulk of the party, confining dissent as far as possible to the realm of ideology. Meanwhile, however, the political logic of the conflict within the SPD was moving unstoppably toward an organizational split. It was the majority that took the initiative, in keeping with the wishes of the Hausa Ledebur Kautsky Center, who shrank from the responsibility of scission. On the 7th of January 1917, the Center and Spartacist groups held a general conference in Berlin to respond to the creeping expulsions and discriminatory administrative measures being taken by the majority against both oppositions. The conference was attended by 157 delegates, 19 of whom were members of parliament, about 30 of them belonged to the Spartacist wing. The central themes of the debate were the attitude to be taken toward war and peace, and the relations to be adopted toward the supporters of the majority. The oppositionists made no call for a split, but showed their resolve not to renounce their own political identity. Kautsky drafted the Peace Manifesto of the Opposition, in which the conference formulated the following major goals. 1. A rapid end to the war. 2. Peace not at any price, but, without victors and vanquished, agreement without infringement on the rights of others, 3. Not a peace of diplomats, but of the peoples of the warring countries, who alone were capable of checking the belligerent ambition of the great powers. 4. Full identification of social democracy with the self-determination of peoples. 5. Disarmament. 6. Peace to be guaranteed in future by the proletariat. The response of the trade union leaders and the majority Social Democrats was swift. They decided to expel the opposition. On the 16th of January, the General Commission of the Trade Unions announced its determination to remain fully loyal to the government in the hour of the country's struggle for existence. On the 18th of January, the party leadership, by a vote of 29-10, expelled the Arbeitsgemeinschaft and the leftist groups linked to the Arbeitsgemeinschaft, with the evident aim of preventing any chance of the opposition winning over a majority of the party. Faced with this precipitation of events, Kautsky sought to ensure that the opposition, or at least the most consistent portion of the opposition, should in the hour of its break with the majority, invoke continuity with the traditions of the party. Kautsky strove to put the onus for the split on the majority faction. In addition, Kautsky expressed doubt that the self-proclaimed majority really had the support of the majority of party members, and insisted that it was not the opposition, but the right that was abandoning the past principles of the SPD. In February 1917, Kautsky wrote that, in 42 years of activity in international social democracy, Kautsky had observed that all the splits that had occurred in Austria, England, France, and Russia had seen minorities declare not only their political opposition, but their desire to found new organizations. In Germany, things were different, Kautsky said. In Germany, it could be seriously doubted whether the opposition represented only a minority of the party and whether the forces that commanded a majority of the party leadership and parliamentary caucus still had the allegiance of the majority of the rank and file. A verification of the real relationship of forces would be possible only at a regular party congress, which would reveal the changes in the orientation of the membership that had probably occurred. Under these conditions, the administrative and disciplinary measures taken by the leading bodies controlled by the majority were, according to Kautsky, wholly arbitrary and legitimate. The, quote, Russian Tsar himself, end quote, Kautsky declared, quote, no longer enjoys the luxury of being able to liquidate any opposition through simple administrative deportation, without any trace of judicial procedure or even having to listen to the accused, end quote. Kautsky concluded, quote, the process of disintegration now underway in our ranks is caused primarily by the fact that a party congress is not possible, nor the free agitation of a Congress presupposes. The greater and more energetic number of comrades have been eliminated from party activity, and what remains of this activity is naturally contained within the narrowest limits. The conflict in the party is rooted not merely in the fact that there are two currents, which are indeed moving further and further apart, but also in the fact that the lack of a Congress and the impossibility of deciding which current actually has the majority should make maximum tolerance necessary on the part of the leading bodies of the party, end quote. Kautsky. But this tolerance was lacking among a leadership that had used wartime conditions to strengthen its own, quote, position of power, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky, who had always held the necessity of party unity, did not view the situation with any vigorous resolve to forward the opposition. Kautsky's attitude was pessimistic. Forwärts had defended the decision of the party leadership as an amputation necessary to, quote, realize the unity of the workers' movement at a higher level, end quote. Kautsky replied that what was actually occurring was the, quote, disintegration, the, quote, disaggregation of the party, end quote.
Kautsky's resistance to accepting the reality of the split within the SPD was such that his main demand continued to be the right of the opposition to exist in the party. The, quote, opposition, Kautsky wrote, quote, has, no reason to provoke a split before the next Congress. What it must demand is only the necessary freedom of movement to be able to express itself as an opposition within the party, end quote. Kautsky. Given the division of political lines which inevitably found expression in different attitudes in the Reichstag, the opposition, quote, should be guaranteed the use of the only free tribune still available today, namely Parliament. The opposition must oppose with all its might the tendency to suffocate the entire opposition press or to transform the opposition press into the official agency of the leadership, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky reminded both the, quote, majority faction and the, quote, Spartacists that if matters should come to the actual formation of two workers' parties, there should be no illusion that it would be easy to reunify the two parties after the war, given the conflicts and lacerations that would have occurred between them. In a harsh attack on the majority which belied Kautsky's later affirmation, when Kautsky returned to the SPD, that his contradictions with the majority had been secondary while his differences with the, quote, Spartacists had been antagonistic. Kautsky commented that a party built by majority supporters would be a, quote, national social party. Quote,
to a large extent dependent on the goodwill of the bourgeois parties, end quote. Thus, if it came to the formation of two parties, one would be a, quote, democratically organized party, end quote, while the other would be a party, quote, subjected to a centralized bureaucracy, end quote. One would be internationalist, the other prepared to subordinate internationalism to whatever could, quote, serve its own people, end quote. Kautsky. One would be committed to promoting, quote, a struggle for the emancipation, end quote, of the working class, the other essentially to defending, quote, its most immediate material interest, end quote. Kautsky. One would be determined to re-establish the tradition of the party, the other transformed into, quote, a genuine national social party, end quote. One would be based on the most combative layers of the proletariat, the other on the less militant strata of the proletariat and petty bourgeois white-collar workers, on those groups which led, quote, an intermediary existence between the proletariat and the capitalist class, end quote. Kautsky. The, quote, national social, end quote, party would end up competing with the Catholic Center Party and the progressive liberals for the allegiance of the same constituencies. Given Kautsky's approach to the internal struggle in the SPD, it was predictable that Kautsky would not favor the transformation of the ideological and organizational fissure within it into the foundation of a new party. Hence Kautsky's behavior at the conference called by the opposition in Gotha 6th to 8th of April 1917, which was to become the founding congress of the Unabhängige Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, USPD, Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. It voted to form a new party by 77 to 42. Among those voting against were Kautsky, Bernstein, and Kurt Eisner. Kurt Eisner lived from 1867 to 1919, was a German politician, revolutionary, journalist, and theater critic. As a socialist journalist, Kurt Eisner established the socialist revolution that overthrew the Wittelsbach monarchy in Bavaria in November 1918, which led Kurt Eisner being described as, quote, the symbol of the Bavarian Revolution, end quote. Kurt Eisner is used as an example of charismatic authority by Max Weber. Kurt Eisner subsequently proclaimed the People's State of Bavaria, but was assassinated by far-right German nationalist Anton Graf von Arco auf Fally in Munich on the 21st of April 1919. Back to the text. The new party was born divided. The USPD's common denominator was opposition to the pro-governmental line of the majority over the war. Beyond this, however, the potential for conflicts within the USPD can be seen merely by listing the most famous figures who joined the USPD: Bernstein, Eisner, Kautsky, Haase, Ledebour, Hilferding, Mehring, Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and Zetkin, a spectrum of opinion divided by the most profound ideological, political, and organizational divergences. Right-centrist, left-centrist, and Spartacists had fought and would continue to fight ferociously with each other. What brought them together for the moment was a negation. It would soon be shown that the political prerequisites for transforming this negative unity into positive agreement were lacking. Consistent with his opposition to the construction of a new party and his insistence on the importance of the social democratic tradition, Kautsky first voted against the foundation of an independent party, and then, once the decision was made, sought, together with Bernstein and Eisner, to see to it that the old name of the party was maintained. For years now, the aged theoretician had been subjected to a crossfire of violent criticism from many of the major figures of the new party. Significantly, however, the manifesto in which the USPD justified the reasons for the USPD's own foundation was not only written by Kautsky, but was approved with only one dissenting vote. The content of this manifesto corresponded exactly to the analysis Kautsky had developed during the preceding period. It accused the, quote, government socialist, unquote, trade union leaders and SPD parliamentary caucus of having adopted and consolidated during the war the tendencies of the pro-government right of the pre-war period, of having succumbed to National Socialism and National Liberalism, of having broken with the tradition of the party, of having failed to influence the policy of the government in any way, of having sacrificed the freedoms of the workers, of having put themselves at the disposal of the government's wartime mobilization industry. To the policy of the, quote, government socialists, end quote, the manifesto counterposed the need to launch, quote, a campaign against rising prices and unemployment, end quote, as the basis of workers' struggles in the post-war period, declaring that the, quote, popular will must become the supreme law, end quote, parenthesis, which suggested an appeal for a democratic republic, end parenthesis. The manifesto demanded an immediate amnesty for political prisoners, full rights of association, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly, introduction of the 8-hour day, and equal and secret universal suffrage for both men and women to all elective bodies. The manifesto also hailed the Second Russian Revolution, which had brought down Tsarism. In Russia, Kautsky wrote, even the bourgeoisie had pronounced itself for the democratic republic, while the government socialists in Germany accepted the principle of the monarchy. This is a policy that provoked failure after failure. It led, quote, not to the reinforcement and rising enthusiasm of the proletariat, but to the weakening of its power and the diminution of its influence, end quote. Against this sort of policy, Kautsky held up the, quote, shining example of the Russian workers, who had shown their ability to pursue a, quote, socialist and democratic policy, end quote, and whose action had overthrown Tsarism, quote, the strongest bastion of reaction, end quote. Kautsky. At this point, the manifesto drafted by Kautsky spoke of the objectives of peace in terms that were characteristic of the position of the, quote, center. Quote, the workers of Russia have struggled to establish democracy and to open the road to socialism. But the workers of Russia have also struggled for peace, for the most rapid end to the most frightful of all wars by the conclusion of a peace based on the foundations of our common socialist principles, ... We seek a peace through concord among peoples, without direct or disguised annexations, on the basis of the decision of peoples themselves, with the international limitation of armaments and compulsory tribunals of arbitration. We see these institutions not as magic instruments to assure peace, but as the most effective aids to the proletarian struggle to preserve peace. Our major task after the war, ... against the national solidarity of classes, we stand for the international solidarity of the proletariat, the international struggle of the working class, end quote. Kautsky. The USPD program was essentially aimed at the recovery of the proletariat's freedom of action within the framework of a democratic parliamentary republic. It is no accident that the USPD program contained not a word about any future shift of the class struggle in a revolutionary direction. The representative democracy, political liberty with civic rights of association, and a democratic peace, not the struggle for socialism or the onset of a revolutionary process. These are the slogans of the, quote, center and of Kautsky himself. In sum, it was a program for a reversion to the road that had been closed by the war, in the context of the crisis now generated by the war. Socialism was postponed until a majority was obtained in Parliament after the re-establishment of the mechanism of the parliamentary political struggle. Although Kautsky's draft was accepted by the, quote, Spartacists for tactical reasons in the particular conjuncture of 1917, Kautsky's draft made future ruptures within the new party inevitable. Meanwhile, Kautsky's adherence to the USPD led inevitably to Kautsky's dismissal from the editorial board of Die Neue Zeit, the party's theoretical journal, which Kautsky had founded in 1883. New section. For a, quote, peace without annexations, end quote. We have seen that both the manifesto of Das Gebot der Stunde and the program Kautsky composed for the founding Congress of the USPD emphasized the demand for a peace based on renunciation of all annexations, a notion closely linked to Kautsky's strategic concern to resume the road that had been interrupted in Germany on the 4th of August 1914. This was a conception equally distant from the positions of the, quote, government socialists and of those who denied that a democratic peace was possible and held that the struggle against the war was the beginning of a revolutionary socialist process. The International Socialist Conference held in Simmerwald in Switzerland on the 5th to 8th of September 1915 at the initiative of the Italian Socialist Party was the first international gathering of the socialist movement after the crisis of August 1914. The conference united, or rather witnessed, a confrontation among 38 delegates from various countries. A resolution drafted by Lenin called for the transformation of the, quote, domestic truce in the belligerent countries into civil war. The resolution exhorted the socialist parties to break not only with, quote, social chauvinism, but also with the so-called center, which had yielded Marxist positions to the chauvinists. It warned socialists not to allow themselves to be infected by the, quote, hope that, without the revolutionary overthrow of the present-day governments, a possibility exists of a speedy democratic peace, which will be durable in some degree, and will preclude any oppression of nations, a possibility of disarmament, etc., end quote. It declared that, quote, only the social revolution of the proletariat opens the way to peace and freedom for the nations, end quote. The only way out of the objective crisis was the, quote, conquest of political power by the proletariat, end quote. Lenin. This resolution was rejected, as was Lenin's call for a break with the Second International and the construction of a new international. The manifesto that was adopted by the majority at Simmerwald, drafted by Kautsky, typified the outlook of the international, quote, center. It called for political struggle against the, quote, domestic truce, as well as struggle against the imperialist governments to achieve a peace without annexations, in other words, characteristically Kautskyian demands. The Conference of Kiental, 24th to the 30th of April 1916, once again rejected Lenin's position and reiterated the need for a peace without annexations. At the same time, however, it marked a turn to the left. Although they did not endorse the call for the foundation of a new international or the slogan to turn the imperialist war into a civil war, the resolutions adopted in Kiental criticized any form of support to the belligerent governments more drastically, denouncing any vote in favor of war credits and denying that the strategic or military position of any given country could modify this principle. The Kiental Conference declared that the Executive Committee of the International had abandoned its duty to combat social chauvinism resolutely, and that socialism alone could end imperialism and ensure peace. All this put a very different construction on the, quote, struggle for a peace without annexations, end quote, inherited from Simmerwald, one that Lenin and the revolutionary left could view as a first step towards a new internationalism, while, quote, centrists like Kautsky saw it as a drift towards radicalism. Kautsky argued that, quote, defense of the fatherland, end quote, votes for war credits and annexations, parenthesis, in other words, war aims, end parenthesis, all had to be considered in the light of their concrete consequences in specific historical situations. From the end of 1916 to the first half of 1917, Kautsky maintained that it would be a mistake, for example, to adopt a position of abstract principle on the problem of national, quote, defense. Above all, recalling the position taken by Marx in 1870 at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War, as well as the attitude of August Bebel, Kautsky maintained that social democracy was not opposed to national defense in and of itself. Quote, rejection of national defense is a matter of principle, end quote. Kautsky wrote, quote, is in conflict with our program, ... To reject national defense would be to announce the impotence of a people before any armed foreign government. It would mean that until the social revolution breaks out, what happens to peoples is a matter of complete indifference to us. It would leave a clear path for any unscrupulous conqueror. But to say that social democrats accepted the principle of national defense did not mean that once a war broke out, they had to support the foreign policy and military strategy of a bourgeois government and imperialism. The concepts of Marx, Engels, Bebel, and Wilhelm Liebknecht certainly had nothing to do with the policies of governments. They had advocated the right to defense, quote, not in the name of the particular national interest of their own country, but in the name of international democracy, end quote. The practice and essential criterion for determining the attitude of the proletariat and of Democrats was the political nature of the aims of the war. In this sense, the question of which side was the aggressor in the formal sense could never be decisive, since a country could initiate a war for reasons that were substantially defensive, end parenthesis. Quote, the issue over which a war breaks out is neither the only nor the most important element. In determining our attitude towards the war. Much more important is our assessment of the objectives of the war. End quote. Kautsky. Since it was the objectives of the war that defined the nature of the war and the real basis for a future peace. In fixing war, it was war aims alone that were relevant to the international proletariat in fixing the international proletariat's policy. In the present world war, Kautsky said, social democracy must struggle for a peace without annexations as the necessary foundation for an ulterior resumption of internationalism and of social struggle. Quote, the dispute in our ranks over national defense is now quite clear. The dispute in our ranks over national defense does not consist in the fact that some accept national defense while others reject national defense, but rather that for some their attitude towards the government is a function of national defense, while for others their attitude towards national defense is a function of their assessment of the policy of the government. In this regard, we should never lose sight of the fact that the expression, quote, national defense is merely a euphemism for the conduct of the war, end quote. Kautsky. Hence Kautsky's appeal to the Zimmerwald Manifesto, quote, only those parties and minorities, of parties, that determine their attitude toward governments, not on the basis of national defense, but solely on their judgment of the policy of governments, and which stand before these governments in full liberty, not only in form but also in substance. Only these can re-establish the international and assume the leading role in bringing about concord among nations at war. Zimmerwald has proven this, end quote. Kautsky. I think I'm going to cut this off here, and because the next section is titled Russia 1917, quote, democracy first, then socialism, end quote. Just so I have a separate video for this. I might actually include this part in this video and have a separate YouTube video of this so I might have the same content up twice, but in different videos, so that seems like a healthy compromise. Alright, so I'm going to stop recording this, and then I'm going to start recording a separate file. Okay, so I ended that recording. I'm starting a new one. If you're listening to the entire chapter, this is the fourth and final section of the chapter. It's titled Russia 1917, Democracy First, then Socialism. But I'm also going to have this as a separate video because my particular interest for reading this chapter in the first place was to see what Kautsky had to say about Russian Revolution 1917. So here we go. The section 4 is titled Russia 1917, quote, Democracy First, then Socialism, end quote. Alright, so here we go. In the manifesto Kautsky drafted for the Gotha Congress that ratified the birth of the USPD, Kautsky had hailed the February Revolution in Russia as a shining example of democratic and socialist politics, contrasting the struggle of the Russian workers to the degeneration of the German, quote, government socialists, end quote. Kautsky then wrote a close analysis of the Russian events in a fundamental article titled Die Aussichten der Russischen Revolution, which surveyed 1. The relationship between democracy and socialism, 2. The relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, 3. The relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry, 4. The international effects of the revolution, both on the World War and on the internal political situation in Central Europe. The consolidation of the Russian Revolution, Kautsky declared, would signal, quote, a new epoch for all Europe, end quote, and in particular would constitute a, quote, powerful advance of the political forces of the toiling classes throughout the capitalist world. Commenting on the internal dynamic of the revolution, Kautsky noted that because of the leading role played by the working class, which possessed a, quote, strong class consciousness, end quote, and leaders armed with the, quote, science of the 20th century, end quote, the revolution had a, quote, predominantly proletarian, end quote, character from the outset. The fundamental question in Russia, therefore, revolved around the roles that would be played by the working class and the bourgeoisie, the, quote, consolidation of the conditions of the new state order, end quote. Kautsky wrote, quote, strictly depends on the question, on this question, rule the proletariat or rule the bourgeoisie, end quote. Kautsky. According to Kautsky, rehearsing many of the essential points of Kautsky's analysis of the 1905 revolution in Russia, the historical peculiarity of the Russian Revolution was that the leading role of the socialist proletariat was combined with general social and economic backwardness and an insufficient numerical expansion of the working class as a social productive force, which made it unthinkable that the Russian Revolution would become a socialist revolution capable of initiating a new form of production superseding capitalism. This contradiction would be resolved only by understanding the function of democracy not merely as a formal procedure, but as a substantive means to assure economic and social development in a context defined by three critical factors: the political influence of the proletariat, the needs of the peasant masses who had an interest in bourgeois democratic ownership of land, and the weakness of the advanced productive sector, in other words, of industry. Quote, the proletariat, Kautsky wrote, quote, urgently needs two things: democracy, and socialism, Democracy means the most extensive political freedoms and rights of the popular masses, the transformation of the institutions of the state and the local administrative bodies into pure instruments of the popular masses. Socialism means the transformation of private production for the market into social production, that is, state, communal, or cooperative production for the needs of society. The proletariat needs both in equal measure, end quote. Kautsky. After these assertions, Kautsky commented, a significant remark in the light of Kautsky's future attitude towards the Bolshevik regime, quote, social production without democracy would become a most oppressive bond. Democracy without socialism would allow the persistence of economic dependence of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy was not an ideal exclusive to the proletariat, but it was the proletariat that now fought for democracy most energetically, since the bourgeoisie could live without democracy, while the proletariat lost all possibilities for action if there was no democracy. Moreover, democracy could be introduced, quote, wherever there was proletarian struggle. Socialism, on the other hand, was an aim characteristic only of the proletariat. The introduction of socialism was impossible if modern forces of production were insufficiently developed, not only because of the consequent technological obstacles, but also, and even more importantly, because the proletariat would be too weak to direct economy and society. The Russian Revolution should thus aim at the consolidation of a democratic republic in which a progressive government could promote the rapid development of modern industry and so strengthen the working class numerically and mature the working class politically. This prospect was possible only in the context of a democratic system. Democracy, the exercise of civic freedoms, facilitated the formation of a proletariat capable of becoming a ruling class and thereby providing the basis for socialism. Quote, democracy, Kautsky wrote, quote, is now even more important than the economic elevation of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. Democracy alone constituted the, quote, foundation on which, quote, a process of lasting growth of the popular masses is possible, end quote. Kautsky. Quote, for this reason, end quote, Kautsky continued, the significance of democracy was not that democracy made, quote, the conquest of political positions possible. It also had inestimable value in areas where it offers no immediate practical advantage from the standpoint of realpolitik. In order to liberate themselves, the workers, in addition to growing in numbers and winning certain material advantages, must also become, quote, new men, endowed with those capacities which are necessary for a new order of state and society. These abilities are acquired only through class struggle, which as a process directed by its own participants must not be guided by secret committees that issue orders to the proletarian masses, but requires democratic rights and freedoms, end quote. Kautsky. The backwardness of Russia, Kautsky argued, was patent from the relationship between the city and the country. The urban industrial proletariat in Russia was too weak numerically. In 1913, only 24 million people lived in cities, 150 million in the countryside. Because of the low level of general economic development, this imbalance was aggravated by the lack of adequate communications and the intense social and political isolation of the rural population. In this context, Kautsky held, socialization could not prevail in a democratic political system in the near future, for its necessary preconditions were lacking. Quote, there is no doubt, end quote, Kautsky observed, quote, that Russian capitalism still furnishes too limited a base for development in a socialist direction, end quote. This did not mean that there were no important sectors that should be subjected to measures of public control or should become social property. Indeed, it was necessary to proceed forthwith to the nationalization of the major industries, railroads, mines, and metallurgical complexes. In addition, Kautsky held that the property of the Tsar and the monasteries should be confiscated and the estates of the large landlords nationalized. These sectors, Kautsky said, should be managed by the democratic state in a climate of full freedom for the proletariat. In private industry, the proletariat should enjoy maximum opportunities to defend the proletariat's own interests, protection of labor, the 8-hour-a-day, unemployment insurance, distribution of food products to the working population at low prices. Finally, to cover growing state expenditure, progressive taxes would have to be introduced, falling exclusively on the shoulders of the possessing classes. These, Kautsky argued, were the measures the new Russia needed if the new Russia was to establish a political democracy with an advanced social content. For Kautsky, political democracy was the necessary form of the class struggle in Russia and the proper gauge of the real relationship of class forces. Quote, this, Kautsky commented, quote, may be defined as a bourgeois reformist program and not a program of proletarian revolution, end quote. Kautsky, but it was the only program which, because of this program's advanced reformist character, could take account of the strength of the proletariat and the peasantry on the one hand, and the weakness of the bourgeoisie on the other, and yet, because of its non-socialist character, simultaneously accord with the overall backwardness of modern industry in Russia. The relationship between bourgeois reformism and social revolution depended on the dynamic evolution of social struggle and economic progress. Whether the program leaned, quote, this way or that, end quote, i.e. in a more bourgeois or more proletarian direction, quote, depends on quantitative elements, end quote. However, here again, end quote, Kautsky continued, quote, quantity, when sufficiently increased, must yield a new quality. The proletariat, as soon as the proletariat finds its feet, will inevitably do the proletariat's utmost to exploit the situation in the direction outlined above, bracket, i.e. the direction of social revolution, end bracket, and in so doing will clash with the resistance of the capitalist and large landlords. Exactly when this happens will depend on the relative strength of the proletariat, end quote. Kautsky. As for the peasants and the attitude the proletariat should take towards the peasants, Kautsky reiterated Kautsky's analysis of 1905, declaring that the workers had every interest in aiding the peasants to gain land. Once this had been won, the peasants would feel linked to the cause of the revolution, and the counter-revolution would lose the counter-revolution's strength, above all because the great majority of the army was composed of peasants. Quote, when the peasants are won over, the army will also be won to the young republic and will become a force for its defense. End quote. Kautsky's conclusion was that if Russian democracy succeeded in stabilizing Russian democracy's self, the East would be rejoined to the West, and a common road would be opened to the conquest of political power by the proletariat, quote, the mass movement and mass organizations would then be assured the most solid foundation for the conquest of political power in Eastern Europe, at least as firmly as in the West, end quote. Kautsky. It should be noted that the East was to be reunited with the West on the common basis of political democracy as the, quote, general form of the conduct of the social struggle for socialism. One second. In August 1917, Kautsky singled out two urgent necessities for the Russian Revolution. One, the attainment of peace. Two, the convocation of a constituent assembly. It was Kautsky's view that the movement for peace could unite the Russian working class and the progressive parties of the new republic with the action of the Western proletariat in a common framework of democracy. It will also corresponded to the need to safeguard Russian democracy itself. Quote, war and democracy are two phenomena that are not easily compatible. ... A rapid peace is indispensable for the success of the Russian Revolution, end quote. Nevertheless, the peace Russia needed was not just any peace at any price. Peace could be real only if that peace was, quote, without annexations and reparations, based on the right of self-determination of peoples on both sides, end quote. Kautsky. It was thus related to the problem of a more general peace. The Russian Revolution must also integrate itself into the action of the international. Quote, revolutionary Russia alone is not capable of concluding peace on the foundations revolutionary Russia chooses. This is a task of the international. It is its duty both to the Russian Revolution and to itself. End quote. Kautsky. The international socialist movement should understand that a failure of the revolution in Russia would retard and hamper, quote, the process of democratization in Central Europe, end quote. Kautsky's insistence on the need to convoke the Constituent Assembly in Russia was consistent with his analysis of the importance of democratic procedures for the future of that country. Kautsky observed that a radicalization was occurring in the internal struggle among those classes that, quote, took part in the destruction of the old government, end quote. He viewed with concern the possibility that this struggle might burn itself out without the creation of any general representative institution. Parenthesis. Kautsky did not mention Soviets, a form Kautsky would not have deemed suitable for the representation of all classes and therefore as the basis for a national government, end parenthesis. Quote, the election of the Constituent Assembly. The election of the Constituent Assembly, Kautsky wrote, quote, is an urgent necessity, not in order to neutralize the conflicts among classes and parties, but rather to permit a more accurate assessment of their strength and thus to lend their struggles a more rational foundation, end quote. Here they reemerged again. Here there reemerged again Kautsky's traditional theme of the need to endow any great state with a general technical political instrument of leadership. For Kautsky, this instrument could only be a constituent assembly and therefore a parliament. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, Kautsky wrote a comment, Die Eroberung der Bolsheviki, in which Kautsky emphasized the dangers of a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat in such a backward country and examined the factors that had led to Lenin's victory. But there was no, quote, condemnation of the insurrection. Kautsky's condemnation only came later, when the Bolsheviks dissolved the Constituent Assembly. Kautsky viewed as a break with an act which Kautsky viewed as a break with democracy. It is significant that Kautsky first hailed the advent of the Bolsheviks to power not in terms of a, quote, coup d'etat, but as the accession of the proletariat to power. Quote, for the first time in world history, the proletariat has now conquered governmental power in an entire great state, end quote. Kautsky. But Kautsky continued by adding, quote, how will all this end, end quote. Analyzing the social and economic conditions of Russia, Kautsky highlighted the difficulties facing the new regime, particularly the fact that 3/4 of the Russian population lived in a backward countryside. But Kautsky did not overlook some positive features. The existence in the great cities, the center of political life, a, quote, very modern large-scale industry, end quote. The revolutionary spirit of a proletariat, parenthesis, note this, end parenthesis, quote, completely free of the bourgeois traditions that burden the workers of Western Europe, end quote. The guidance of this proletariat by Marxist leaders. Thus, everything would depend on the way in which the contradiction of an advanced revolutionary proletariat in a generally very backward country was handled. Discussing the contrasting policies of the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks towards the problem that had divided the two currents of Russian socialism, how to prevent the, quote, exclusive power, end quote, of the bourgeoisie, Kautsky underscored the factors that had favored the triumph of the Bolshevik line. The Mensheviks had relied on a coalition government, the Bolsheviks on a dictatorship of the proletariat, supported by the revolutionary section of the peasantry, and on immediate peace. The peasants' hunger for land and the masses' desire for peace, neither of which had been satisfied, had swung the balance decisively to the Bolsheviks, assuring the Bolsheviks victory. But Kautsky continued, the very factors that had given the Bolsheviks victory posed a serious threat to the Bolsheviks after the seizure of power, because of the internal contradictions of class relations in Russia. The advanced proletariat, a minority, had been able to seize power in the cities, parenthesis, and thus make itself master of the entire country, since only the cities had real weight in a decisive contest, end parenthesis, by taking advantage of the democratic struggle of the peasants in the countryside. Now, however, the fact that the proletariat controlled only the cities would become a disadvantage. The workers would have to confront the anarchy in the countryside, and the danger of civil war would soar the moment the bourgeoisie was violently assaulted. Quote, the outlook of the Bolsheviks, end quote, Kautsky wrote, quote, was the most straightforward and corresponded more than any other to the class situation of the proletariat. But it also threatened to sharpen to the maximum the contradiction between the intense effort of the proletariat and the low level of development of the empire, end quote, Kautsky. The Bolsheviks now had to take account of the threats arising primarily from the particularism of the peasantry. Kautsky concluded that the Russian working class was not capable of introducing socialism, and that it should therefore refrain from installing a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, since, quote, in the conditions of Russia, end quote, this would open the road to, quote, the political and social disintegration of the country, to chaos, and thus also to the moral bankruptcy of the revolution, to the counter-revolution, end quote. The Russian Revolution had so far been dominated by the failure of coalition governments, which could have completed their, quote, their mission only if they had rapidly achieved peace and convened the Constituent Assembly, end quote. The inability to satisfy these exigencies had led to the victory of the Bolsheviks. Given the unresolved problems in Russia, Kautsky did not take a position against the Bolsheviks in principle. Kautsky expected the Bolsheviks to act as a decisive force for a social change, which would not conflict with political democracy, parenthesis, which meant convocation of and respect for the Constituent Assembly, end parenthesis. Kautsky had respect for the Bolsheviks and something more as well. Quote, now, Kautsky wrote, quote, we will see whether the fears about their rise were justified. The Bolsheviks do not lack energy. In the Bolsheviks' ranks are extremely intelligent comrades, rich in experience, but the inherent difficulties of the real conditions are enormous. If they succumb in overcoming these real conditions, the difficulties of the real conditions, it will be something extraordinary. A new epoch of world history is beginning, end quote. Kautsky, looking forward to the advent of parliamentarism in Russia, parenthesis, when they took power, the Bolsheviks promised that they would do what none of the other governments since the February Revolution had done, namely convoke the Constituent Assembly, end parenthesis. Kautsky urged a parliament linked to the masses. Quote, the introduction of a parliament is one aspect of democratization, but it is not sufficient in itself. Important as the dependence of the government on parliament may be, it leads to democratization only when it is accompanied by the growing dependence of parliament on the popular masses. A parliament is deprived of strength when it cannot rely on the mass of the people, end quote. Kautsky, in other words, was reaffirming his classical point of view. Defense of universal suffrage and political democracy on the one hand, insistence on the role of socialists in bringing the social weight of the toiling masses to bear within political democracy and representative institutions on the other hand. The subsequent evolution of the Russian Revolution, especially the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly and the abolition of universal suffrage by the Bolsheviks, leading to what Kautsky was to call the, quote, dictatorship of the Russian communists, was to be denounced by him as a double betrayal of democracy and of socialism. It was then that the, quote, insurrection of the Bolsheviks, end quote, assumed the character of a coup d'etat in his eyes. That's the end of the section and the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.